Hello, everyone. Today, we invited Glenn Diesen to talk with us. Hello, Glenn.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Very good, thanks. Yep.
Glenn is professor of political science at the University of Southeastern Norway. He is a foremost expert on Russia and on international relations. He's also affiliated with Valdai Club, and he is also an editor of the Russia in Global Affairs journal. Glenn has written many books on international politics, focusing on the role of Russia in international politics, as well as on Russian domestic politics. We also know him from his regular podcasts with John Mersheimer, Alexander Mercouris, and other, I would say, interesting speakers, such as Sergei Karaganov or Alexander Dugin. By the way, was your interview with Dugin, and I can only recommend this interview, was this interview the reason why you were banned from YouTube? Because I understood that you were banned for some time.
Yeah, well, they don't provide you with good reason. They just ban you. So, but it was coincidentally, well, probably not a coincidence, but it was immediately after this interview with Dugin. But it was strange because I knew that he was a bit, that he's censored a bit, especially in the United States. But our interview was pretty much only about the challenges of modernity and
It was a political philosophy, basically. It was very much about political philosophy, which was put, I would say, in a very consumer-friendly way. So it was understandable. So, yeah, so that was my suspicion, when I heard the news about your being banned and then saw the interview with Dugin, then I saw the causal connection between them. But, well, we invited you to talk with us today because of the latest edition of your book, because of the Czech translation of the book, which is in English called Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. The book has just been published by Lukáš a Syn, Brno Publishing House, and is now available to Czech readers. So we will talk mainly about this book. The book, I would say, presents a realist perspective on international politics. You yourself I'm not sure if you are a card-carrying member of the Club of Realism, but you are definitely associated with this stream of thinking. And I would say that the book has two important parts. The first part is about the world order, investigating the historical evolution of the Western world order and now its decay. It's the order which we can call a liberal order, guaranteed by the American hegemony. You also hint at the international order in making, which is likely to be more multipolar than hegemonic, and which is likely to be more Eurasian than Atlanticist. So that's the first part. The second part focuses on the Ukraine conflict, on its causes, evolution, and also on the tragic results which we see in the current war, which is being waged for more than 2 years. Glenn, let me start with Ukraine, and then we will proceed to the international order. And the conventional wisdom, which is so widespread in the West, puts the conflict down to the Russian aggression and Putin insanity. This is the talk which we hear quite often, not only in Czech media, but also in the Western media. You present Russia as a moderate great power and Putin as a cautious and prudent leader who was provoked into war by the reckless expansion of the American zone of interest or sphere of interest. So would you summarize a bit where you principally diverge from the dominant Western narrative? And also, then we will discuss actually a bit about other issues. But let's start with this. There is a dominant Western narrative, and you diverge from it significantly.
Well, let me first say this is a great privilege for me. It's not every day I'm interviewed by a former deputy foreign minister, so this is a great privilege. But there is a contradiction, though, with presenting Putin as being very irrational and crazy, because keep in mind that NATO's escalation in this war has been premised on the idea that the Russians and Putin then is very, very rational. That is, if you remember, towards the beginning of the war, Biden even warned that we could not send F-16s because this would trigger World War III. Yet NATO is comfortable enough to do this gradual escalation, knowing that the Russians are doing a cost-benefit analysis in terms of how it can retaliate, whether or not, or to what extent it can retaliate, in order not to trigger a larger war. So, given how much we're betting on the rationality of Putin, it obviously doesn't conform with the narrative, but for someone also like yourself who's been watching European politics and being a part of it, it's also important to realize that over the past few years we have walked away from looking at objective reality, and instead we're living in a more postmodernist world where we think we can socially construct a new reality. Now, within this framework, it's always important to construct and defend narratives, and often these narratives have to be defended from facts. So you asked if I deviate from the Western narrative, or when I do so. I think I very much agree with the Western narrative, the one we had in the 90s, because in the 90s, none of what I'm saying was controversial. Keep in mind that when NATO decided to expand, it was recognized that this would redivide the continent, that we would then not remove dividing lines, but gradually put them towards Russian borders. It was recognized this would be seen as a betrayal to the Russians, that they would react quite fiercely. Even Bill Clinton himself argued this in January of '94, that if we expand NATO, this might redivide the continent and restart the logic of the Cold War. His U.S. Minister of Defense essentially, he considered quitting in his position in protest, and he recognized that everyone in the administration agreed with this. Of course, this was going to be a huge betrayal to the Russians. Even the people who advocated for us expanding NATO recognized that, like Madeleine Albright, recognized this would provoke the Russians. However, her argument was, well, Russia's weak, it's getting weaker, and if we do have a conflict, at least we'll have NATO surrounding Russia, so we will be in a favorable position. So it was an insurance policy. This is how it was seen. This is why George Kennan also warned that this would start another Cold War, and once the Cold War began, we would blame the Russians for simply, reacting out of a vacuum. So I think all of this has...
Well, Kennan is a very interesting personality, because actually he was against the NATO foundation in 1948, 1949, because he argued that it's not the adequate response to the Soviet threat. For him, the adequate response was actually the Marshall Plan, which he authored. And then in the 1990s, he was actually still vivid enough to warn against the NATO expansion, as actually, I would say, most realistic thinkers did. And at that time, as you actually correctly remind us, it was completely acceptable position, not only in academia, but also in public discourse. Today, actually, something wrong happened. But going back to Ukraine, you actually, in your book, you list actually all these steps, all these sort of, I would say, the ladder. It was sort of an escalation ladder. What is, in your opinion, the point which you consider crucial, or the point of no return, or the milestone which broke something? Is it 2008? Is it 2014? Is it later? Was it earlier? Where would you see like the key milestone? Or is it possible actually to determine a key milestone?
Well, I think it's difficult to put one milestone, but obviously 2008 is an important time, because in April of 2008 is when NATO decided or promised Ukraine and Georgia future NATO membership. And again, this was very controversial. As we remember, the Europeans pushed hard against it. Angela Merkel referred to it as being interpreted by Moscow as a declaration of war. We have the CIA director now, Burns, arguing that this could trigger a civil war and a Russian invasion. All the things which has happened. So again, it should not be controversial. This was very predictable. And also back in 2008, we have to remember that only about 20% of Ukrainians even wanted NATO. So we knew back then that the Ukrainians didn't want NATO, and we knew that it would likely create a war. But nonetheless, we gave this promise to the Ukrainians, and from there on, I think it's been this incrementalism. We have other milestones. As we know, when Yanukovych won the election, all of this was scaled back. They reasserted their neutrality. But a lot of this was openly seen by NATO as being problematic because it prevented further integration, because we wanted this incrementalism. Now, I think 2014 is really a critical point for many reasons. This is when the West backed a coup in Ukraine to effectively pull Ukraine into the NATO orbit. And this, I think this is possibly the most critical time, because until then there was opportunities to reverse, but this also changed Russia forever, I would argue, because for the past 3-4 decades they had envisioned a greater Europe. That was their main strategic objective. Even since Peter the Great, for the past 300 years, they had a Western-centric foreign policy. After this, they began to look towards the east, towards Eurasia, and so they replaced Greater Europe with Greater Eurasia. So this was really an important moment, and this is also when they realized that there couldn't be really any likely compromise with the West. Of course, they had some ambitions to resolve the Ukraine crisis, which is why they agreed to the French and German brokered Minsk agreement. But they then saw for the next 7 years, we didn't push the Ukrainians to implement it. On the contrary, it was seen to be deliberately sabotaged by sending weapons, training them, and building this huge Ukrainian army to effectively change reality on the ground, so they wouldn't have to implement it.
Do you think that Putin felt genuinely cheated when Angela Merkel and others actually later recognized that this Minsk format and Normandy format was just a game so that Ukraine can gain time? Do you think that he was really felt cheated, or did he understand it from the very start that they are playing a game with him?
I think he genuinely felt cheated. Of course, I don't have a window into his head, but I wrote a lot about this in 2016, because at that time there was a lot of pressure mounting on Putin to effectively show more resolve towards NATO, because the main argument was, we should be preparing for war, because by pulling away, trying to restore relations with the West, they see this as weakness. So they saw NATO building up Ukrainian capabilities. And so there's a lot of pressure mounting on Putin, who was seen, again, it's hard for us to recognize in the West, given the media bubble we live in, but it was seen as being too soft, too pro-European, and too weak in many ways. So anyways, this was building throughout, since 2014. It escalates, and especially towards 2019, this is when the US, UK and NATO begins to develop the ports in Ukraine to fit their warships. You see a greater presence, of course, towards 2021. They begin to do all these deals, making effectively Ukraine a de facto member. I cite the November 2021 strategic partnership between Ukraine and the US as being another critical moment. This is when the former advisor of the French president argued that this convinced Russia it either has to attack or be attacked, because this was seen as a way that the Americans were preparing Ukraine to take back Crimea by force and effectively resolving the Donbass issue by force. So this is when the Russians were also pushing very hard for security guarantees. They saw Minsk wasn't being delivered. They asked for security guarantees. Again, if NATO's going to establish itself on the Russian borders, we need some security guarantees, was their message. This was rejected, no security. So the Russians then invaded in 2022. Again, I think they made another mistake, because this overwhelming evidence that their main goal was to impose a favorable peace agreement, that is a settlement, to resolve this issue. And then also overwhelming evidence, the US and UK intervened and prevented this peace. And this is when everything changed, because initially there was a limited force, limited its use of force in order to impose a peace. And after we effectively canceled this or convinced the Ukrainians by Zelensky's own admission that they should pursue war instead. That is, if they fight, we will give them all the weapons they need. This is when it became a war of attrition. We won't talk to the Russians. We won't do any diplomacy. We won't sit down with them. And we'll send all the weapons required for Ukraine to defeat Russia. Again, in a war which Russia considers to be an existential threat. So what does this mean? It's a war of attrition. Each side seeks to bleed each other out. And this is why it's been such a horrific, bloody debacle, which seems to be coming to an end.
That also means that Ukraine cannot win a war of attrition against Russia, because Russian resources are actually much more. Russia is much more. Russian capabilities actually are much stronger than Ukrainians. Thank you for summarizing this evolution which led to the current tragedy. What I find especially valuable in your book is that you do not actually stay on the international level, even though this level is very important, the interaction between the West and Russia, which is probably the decisive part of the story. But you are also able to look inside Ukraine. And I really appreciate the way you actually explained how President Zelensky is to some extent a hostage. He's hostage to United States in many respects, but he's also hostage to powerful domestic forces. Let's call them extremists, because some of these forces are really extreme. And speaking, and again, it doesn't start with Zelensky. It goes back to 2014 and even before. But what I found one of the most important recent findings about 2014 is that actually now it's a well-established fact that people who were actually shooting at Maidan in February were not Yanukovych forces. That these were people, this was the shooting which came from the other side, which I find completely devastating, because these were people who were supposed to be the freedom fighters, democracy fighters. So let's turn our attention to these extremists. What is their role, how important they are, and their relationship with Zelensky? It's actually quite difficult to understand, because Zelensky is Jewish. He talks about it. And some of these forces are actually neo-Nazis, and I mean genuine neo-Nazis. I don't say all of them, but some of them are, and usually the ones who are the best organized.
Yeah, and just on your first point, it's not just that we can't defeat the Russians given their greater potential, but it's also no one actually defined victory. What does victory over the world's largest nuclear power actually means? So we haven't actually defined this. Also, I agree. I think that Zelensky has come under a lot of pressure. It's worth, from the extreme, it's worth noting that both Poroshenko and Zelensky initially distanced themselves fiercely from the nationalists, but they both had to essentially bow. We saw this with Poroshenko when the parliament voted to implement Minsk, and then you had, again, also reported in Western media how the nationalists were pressuring him with violence to reverse this, and he did. So the Ukrainian public therefore voted, 73% for Zelensky, given that he was pushing a peace platform. He was going to talk to Russia, make peace with Donbass, and implement Minsk. But then we saw yet again, very publicly, in front of cameras, all over Ukrainian media, that the far-right extremists, extremists is fine, threatened his life in front of open camera, threatened to have him hanged if he would implement his peace platform. And you saw all the top people who threatened him, they did not go to jail. They received instead a good position in his government. So he bowed to the pressure of the extremists. And you're right, they don't represent the majority views, these fascist ideas of Ukrainians. Indeed, I would say it's a very small view. But as you also said, you don't need to be majority if you wield the violence. And this is why they have also been cultivated by the United States, because the extremists have become a form of veto power. That is, the Ukrainian government will not make any concessions to Russia, do not pursue any peace agreement, or as long as you have this extremist threatening the use of force. Even now, when the war is being lost and Ukraine is being devastated, rationality suggests they would seek a settlement. Any settlement tomorrow will be worse than a settlement today, and they're suffering so greatly. So why aren't they doing it? Well, it's limited what Zelensky can do. I think once he sits down and talks with the Russians, he will have some extremists marching on Kiev. And this, again, this is seen now as breaking with the narrative. But Zelensky is Jewish and all. Yeah, but the United States would under Obama supported some jihadists in the Middle East. Now they're supporting extremist quasi-fascist groups in Ukraine. It's not ideological. I don't think Zelensky is a Nazi. I think he's pragmatic. He sees where the power is, and he accommodates it. So this being Jewish, I don't see necessarily this having being an important thing.
Yeah,
but
I think it's really important to point this out, because when the war started, the Czech government issued like five rules how to talk about Ukraine, and that these were the rules which were supposed to sort of which were supposed to help fight against so-called disinformation. And one of these rules was that it's completely wrong to associate Ukraine with fascism and Nazism because President Zelensky is Jewish, which was a very strange argument. Yeah, but still, they made it on the official paper. That was a governmental statement. So I think what is quite interesting and important in your sober or realistic analysis is that you point to these links, which are from the ideological perspective very unlikely. But in world politics, it's often the case that unlikely alliances play an important role. And you just now referred to the Middle East, where it's like standard that Western powers are able to support all kinds of terrorist groups if these terrorist groups fight against someone who is considered the enemy of the United States. But in your book, there is something actually even more valuable, because you are historians, so you put this historical perspective about the American tradition of supporting the Western extremist group, so-called Operation Gladio. Would you say just a few words about it, what it was? Because you dedicate several pages to it in your book.
Well, it's in the context of the Ukrainian history as well, because I make the point that the United States, they are pragmatic, if anything else, and so I also even cite Harry Truman, who later became president, who argued at the beginning of World War II that if we see the Germans winning, we should help the Soviets. If we see the Soviets winning, we should help Nazi Germany, to let them kill as many of each other as possible. So it doesn't mean that it's a communist or a fascist. It just meant that they're pragmatic. You weaken your adversaries. This is the goal. So after the war, of course, when the Soviets had won, the U.S. began to shift and look towards supporting various fascist groups, simply because they were reliable anti-communists. They were partners, and this is well documented. The CIA took in huge amount of German fascists, and as we saw with Canada as well, they took in a lot of Eastern European Nazis. They had good experiences with the Russians. They were fiercely anti-communist. So they were allies. So again, it's not so much ideology as it is pure pragmatism. And you also had the same with you mentioned the Gladio. This is also the U.S. clandestine stay-behind operations after the Second World War. It lasted all the way to 1990. This is also recognized by the European Union, by the way. So this is not. This shouldn't be controversial. If it's controversial, it's simply because it's not part of the narrative, not because it's not a fact. And the CIA, in cooperation with NATO, would stage false flag terrorist attacks against their own population, which can then be blamed on the Red Brigades. So this is not unusual. This is very much in human nature. That is, human beings, when we see external threats, we demand internal solidarity. And this is why the alliance systems often depend upon perpetuating, if not open conflict, at least tensions to ensure that bloc loyalties and solidarity is maintained. So anyways, this is when you see that the United States began to support a lot of these groups within Ukraine from the late 40s and throughout the 50s. These different former Nazi groups, the Banderas, and even anyways, there have been many of these projects, and this has all, of course, now again been revived. And when we say that it goes against the narrative, I think, again, the word narrative is important, because keep in mind, before the Russians invaded, Western media wrote about the Nazi problem of Ukraine. They wrote that they had a lot of fascists. This was brought up in U.S. Congress because they realized that, to what extent should we actually support and arm Nazis? The Israelis also had a lot of articles in Haaretz, Jerusalem Post, writing about, it's problematic. We're sending weapons to people actually wearing Nazi insignia on their uniforms. In the German media, they mentioned that the more commonality of this phrase, Slava Ukraini, in Ukraine, that this was problematic. This was the Ukrainian version of Heil Hitler, effectively. So this was, again, not me. This was Deutsche Welle, I think, who were writing about this.
It was the greeting of Bandera forces. So there was a clear historical link to the movement, which was actually obviously an objective ally of Nazi Germany.
Yeah, but now forward to 2024, you have the EU Parliament chanting Slava Ukraini and denouncing anyone who criticizes the origin of these ideas as spreading Russian disinformation. But you don't even have to cite Russians. You can cite the same people from 2 years earlier. So there's a lot of dishonesty. But this is my point. The narrative always have to trump the facts.
Speaking about actually all these phenomena, if you look at it from the Russian perspective or from the Western perspective on Russia, because you pointed out to the milestones, to the opportunities which were missed, would you say that also Russia made some mistakes, that Russia also missed some opportunities to have, I would say, more constructive, cooperative relations with Ukraine? Or is it actually just the problem of the United States and the local Ukrainian extremists?
Well, Russia, I think there's several areas where the Russians can be criticized. But when it comes to the security arrangements, I think not. I think on this area, the Russians have all the way since the end of the Cold War called for a pan-European security architecture. They say, Ukraine can be integrated into NATO and the West as long as Russia's brought with it. So you don't create the dividing lines between them. Now, but where the Russians, I think... they can be blamed is obviously that they could have reached out and made some concessions to, for example, Zelensky. They knew that he ran on a peace platform, but he was under great pressure from the nationalists and Americans to abandon this. They instead took a very maximalist position and put a lot of pressure on him, but also wider the recognition for the different forms of nationalism within, or ideas of nation building within Ukraine. Because keep in mind that when the Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians look towards their civilizational origin, they all look towards Kievan Rus. And so when the Russians say, we all origin from Kievan Rus, this is a key fact and it's real. However, the main concern for example, Ukrainians who wants to cement their sovereignty is it can make it seem as if the natural position would be for these areas to reintegrate. That is, we all came from the same place, we got divided, it's natural for us to come together. So the historical narrative can undermine the sovereignty of Ukraine. So for this reason, it incentivizes a counter-narrative, which is that, well, the Ukrainians are the descendant of Kievan Rus. The Russians are merely descendant of the Golden Horde, the Mongols, these Asiatic savages standing at the border of Russia and of the border of Europe. And this kind of made them this ethno-nationalism made very vulnerable to, of course, the fascist ideas. And I think that if Russia pushes too hard with the exact same people, essentially questioning the relevance of sovereignty for Ukraine altogether. I think this incentivizes a counter-reaction, which is this more fierce ethno-nationalist. So obviously, I think Russia could have played its cards very different as well. And But in terms of the actual security architecture, I don't think there can be any doubt, because they pushed very hard since Gorbachev's era. They asked for inclusive pan-European security architecture through OSCE. When they didn't get that, they put in Yeltsin. They both asked, how about we get into NATO? In 2008, they proposed a new pan-European security architecture. They've been pushing all along for this inclusive European system, but this conflicted with our objective to have collective hegemony, that is, create a Europe without the Russians, everyone except Russia, and then we act surprised when this ends not in peace and stability, but obviously in another Cold War.
Yes, I think you are right that from the security perspective, many of the Russians' initiatives were neglected, simply not listened to. I remember this Medvedev plan, and he really genuinely believed that he could actually make a deal with the West, which would give Russia sort of an equal place in the European security architecture. And they just politely listened and didn't react to it, which was probably one of the mistakes which the West did. Going to the second question about the world order. I appreciate, again, the way you write about the historical evolution, and actually also pointed out how important the rivalry between Russia and Britain was in the 19th century, because we tend to forget about it, because in the World War I, they fought on the same side. But in many respects, actually, it was not that much Germany throughout the 19th century, but it was rather Russia who was the main enemy of the UK, of the Great Britain. And then there are sort of small historical gems, I would say, of realistic thinking when you say that UK in the 1920s actually still counted with the possibility that they could have a war with the United States in the 1920s. Not that they would really prepare for it, but that was something which was in the back of their mind. Or actually more recently, the fact that Japan was actually prevented from signing a peace treaty with Soviet Union in the 1950s. These are the facts which are actually not known to me. For me, it was actually a discovery which actually points to this hegemonical construction of the world order, that at the end of the day, power is really very, very important. But still, when we talk about the construction of the world order, power is a key component. But you have at least two other components. One is economy. Today, it's globalized capitalism. And then a normative basis. Today, these are actually the norms which are still called liberal progressivist norms, but they have nothing to do with the classic of liberalism. You, I think, correctly referred to Viktor Orbán. What does he say? What are the liberal norms today? It's war, LGBT, Green Deal, or something like this. So, now, when we talk about the looming multipolar order, the distribution of power is clear. It means that the power will be distributed across several centers. But, where I see the big challenge is how to think about the economy. Is globalized capitalism compatible with multipolarity? Or is it the case that we really need a single power center which will be like the ordering power, which would provide essential public goods, like United States did for some time? And what will be actually the normative basis? Again, we will probably not have thick norms which we have today in this in the shape of this, I would say, post-liberal values, post-liberal norms. What is your thinking about it? Because you talk very much about multipolar order, and obviously you cannot address all of these issues in your book. But when you actually think about the future of global economy, about the normative underpinnings of this multipolar order, where is your thinking on this?
Well, I think both the normative and economics are quite important because keep in mind that the modern world order was born at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. So this was before, obviously, long before Industrial Revolution, and everything was measured more in terms of hard power, military power. Now, but if we first look at the normative issue, it's important to note that what legitimizes the multipolar order, because when you have a hegemon, such as the Roman Empire or Holy Roman Empire, you would have Catholicism, for example, the Catholic Church would be able to argue we represent universal values. This is one church, we represent it, and this is a way of asserting your sovereignty over others. Now, this was one of the recognition during the 30-year war that not only did new centers of power emerge, but with the Reformation, the different parts demanded that they would respect their cultural distinctiveness. So this is something that is important to multipolarity, which is why you also see it from the Russians, the Chinese, even the Indians. They're rejecting the concept of universalism. That is because universalism is related to hegemony. That is when the United States says, you know, the world has universal liberal democratic values. We are the champion of it. This is why we can interfere in your domestic affairs, you know, democracy promotion, humanitarian intervention, but you can't do it to us. So it becomes a system of sovereign inequality. Now, this is inconsistent with the multipolarity, which is why the Chinese, for example, argue that all civilizations have different paths to development. One civilization should not impose itself on another. This norms reaffirms the idea of sovereignty. So this is what you should expect to see in a multipolar system. That and we should actually be happy about this. If the Chinese were talking about global Marxism as a universal idea, this is a way for them to assert universal ideas, legitimizing their interference into domestic affairs of other states. But they're not. They're rejecting it all out. So this should be considered a good indication. Now, so this is how I see the normative. I think it's become fragmenting, but as it fragments, I think it can be a positive development. Not that you organize them hierarchically, which civilization is better than the others, but instead seek cooperation between the civilizations and with different norms and values.
And don't you still need some sort of soft universalism, which would actually make it possible for the great powers to agree on something and to actually share something? Because if I think like yourself, I am also critical of the universalism as we know it today. But just imagine the world where you have no actually universal common ground, then you have no language actually to talk about. You have no norms which would make you comply with what was agreed. I mean, if you cannot imagine diplomacy without the premise of pacta sunt servanda, that you are supposed to actually fulfill what you are obliged to, and that's a norm which needs to be universal. If it's not universal, then it doesn't make sense to make any kind of diplomacy, because you can sign an agreement, but you are not obliged to fulfill it. So do you take into account the possibility of soft universalism, or do you think that it can be based, the new order can be based just on this sort of interplay of particularistic perspectives?
Well, I guess the dark side of that coin is obviously what you're referring to. That is the more relativism. That is, if no values are superior to others, should you compare, how, women are treated in Czech Republic with how they're treated in Saudi Arabia? You should be able to say there's good values and bad values. So the idea of cultural relativism or moral relativism is very reasonable. But the main argument is that the principle of sovereignty should be at the foundation, and then once we agree on this, we can build areas where we agree upon issues. Because the main problem is when we use values and norms in order to undermine sovereignty, I think this is when it becomes very, very problematic. And this is why I often see this idealist internationalism, where one points to ideals in order to degrade the sovereignty of other states. You mentioned Hungary a few times. Hungary is willing to, it agrees with many of the different of the values shared by the rest of the European Union. There's, I think, more that unites than would divide. But what they don't like is when it's other EU members use these values to impose it themselves on Hungary's own path to development, which is often organized around the idea of reproducing its traditions, its Christian heritage. And so I think that without cementing the sovereignty, there will be more and more suspicions around everything about universalism. So,
my take would be that we need to develop some kind of bottom-up universalism, because the universalisms which we encounter today and which we encountered in history was very much top-down. So originally it was the church which imposed actually its teaching. Today it's some group of actually liberal thinkers, NGOs, activists, which still develop new and new concepts, new and new values, and try to impose it on the rest of the world, which is clearly not sound and not acceptable. I think one of the key challenges will also be the economy, because to what extent can we have actually globalized economy? Maybe we will have to give up on the globalized economy in the multipolar world, or is it actually compatible or not?
Well, I think this is a great question because historically, well, now especially since the Industrial Revolution, we have to see the balance of power through the prism of economics, and historically we've had only liberal international economic systems when there's a hegemon, that is Britain from the mid-19th century and then the United States from the mid-20th century, because under these conditions the hegemon has an incentive to facilitate a liberal economic system, because they dominate the high end of all the high-tech industries. So then they have an interest in having free trade, because then their mature industries can compete with the infant industries of other states. They also have an interest in having very open transportation corridors, so states will trust the economic connectivity and not pursue their own autarky or self-reliance. And lastly, if you have a liberal economic system, then there's more willingness to embrace their currency, use their national banks, this kind of thing. So this is for historical reasons. We see that liberal economic systems emerge under hegemon. And then once the hegemon declines, as we see now, you see the hegemon then willing to use its administrative control over the international economy to prevent the rise of other states. So this is, trying to roll back the development of China, stealing the sovereign funds of the Russians, these kind of things. But that doesn't mean that it's not necessarily possible. And indeed, if we look at the American system, which they had from the early 19th century, when the British were the dominant, the whole idea under this economic nationalism was that industrialization and economic sovereignty was a condition for political sovereignty. So unless they developed, again, under the American system, their own manufacturing base, their own roads and ports, their own national bank, without this, they would be subordinated to the British. So this was economic nationalism to assert independence. Now, in a multipolar system, it would be dependent on having several poles of power, which is why you see, for example, the BRICS they're not centralizing it in China. Instead, their main goal is to have many tech hubs across the world and find a way of them to cooperate. They're looking towards having many various infrastructure projects, so not just the Belt and Road from the Chinese, but competing projects from others. And of course, they don't want to use one Chinese currency or create a common currency, because that would be Chinese dominated. Instead, they want to trade with many national currencies to make sure one side doesn't become too dominant over that currency. Same as why there's many national banks, payment systems. And so the point is to diversify it. Now, it could create more use of economic tools for in the economic statecraft. So again, this is a new project, if you will, but it also has an built-in mechanism to it. That is, if one side becomes too aggressive, let's say, for example, tomorrow the Chinese begin to coerce and impose themselves on the Russians or the Indians, or use economic sanctions to heavily invade other countries, then those countries will begin to decouple a bit from the Chinese. They will start to lean towards other centers of power. So this is why This is why it effectively multipolarity creates a punishment for this aggressive behavior. So then there's a natural, and this is the whole balance of power theory. That is, if one side demonstrates expansionist or aggressive tendencies, the rest of the international system will restore the equilibrium.
Gang up against the hegemon. Yeah. I think we will definitely have more diversity in the global economy, and we need to prepare for it and see the opportunities. It seems to me that our economic thinking is still too much shaped by the liberal theories, and these liberal theories have some value. They are not just rubbish. But what is the mistake is that actually the current economic thinking are rubbished all the alternatives to liberal thinking. So we have this great tradition of Alexander Hamilton in America and List in Germany and others who actually developed the idea of some of national economy. Today, I would speak more about regional economies rather than national economies, because such nations as ours are actually quite small to reflect on self-sufficiency, self-reliance. But when we talk about in regional scales, it's quite possible. I would have a question on you where I take issue a bit with what you write, because I mostly agree with what you write in your book. But, given that you are a realist, it seems to me that you are quite optimistic, or I would say too optimistic about the future. One of the subchapters in your book is from unipolar wars to multipolar peace. And I just want you to explain it a bit, because, multipolarity can be very, very cruel. And what we saw in the ancient Greece, actually, when you write about the ancient Greece, you write about this richness of tradition, competition, and how actually important and how actually beneficial this Greek multipolar system was to the development of ideas, institutions, but it was also the system where you had extermination between the Greek cities. They were so incredibly cruel to each other that it's even difficult for us to imagine. And the multipolar order of the 19th century actually resulted in the World War I, which was one of the reasons why actually people hated multipolarity. So I don't say that the way to multipolarity is the way to the hell, but I wouldn't say it's the way to the paradise. My own realism would say that the world is likely to be basically the same with respect to the conflicts. They will be inevitable, and we are likely to fight them. On the other hand, maybe yet you have some more arguments actually to give me to explain why you are so optimistic about multipolar peace.
Well, I think I agree with your statement there, and it reminds me a bit about what the first UN Secretary General said. He said something along the line that the UN isn't supposed to be a stairway to heaven, but prevent a descent to hell. And so I don't expect utopia, but I think. Again, going back to this internal mechanisms that punish expansionism, I think that the balance of power functions more better in a multipolar system, but this is where many realists disagree. Some people see hegemonic stability, in which you have one center of power, but this is premised on the idea that the hegemon is sustainable, because once it's not sustainable, it stops being benign. The problem with bipolarity, where you have two centers of power, is the world is divided into either us or them. So in other words, you had some during the Cold War, you had some people from Rand Institute, for example, contemplating, if we have a nuclear war with the Russians, they lose 100% of their population, we lose 20, it's a win, because everything is relative to the other side. So, but when you have third party and fourth party, then, two sides weaken each other, the third one begins to take a favorable position. So this is also the zero-sum logic really intensifies under bipolarity. So from this perspective, I think that the multipolarity is stronger, and obviously the more it takes the form in economics, the less militarized, the better as well. However, I do see the situation now, though, comparable to that of before the First World War. That is, you're having this rise of this industrial giants competing over market share and economic dominance. And I think the willingness of states to take extreme measures, it increases when there's an all or nothing game. You want to have many small games, not one large one. Now, when there's only two centers of power and one side loses, the other one gains, I think this willingness to take huge risks and fuel more aggressive policies, it tends to intensify. I think now, once when the multipolar logic is recognized, it will incentivize more benign policies. So again, back to the Hungarian example, for example, Hungary has every interest in the world to be a part of the European Union because the EU as an institution offers, for example, collective bargaining power. Together, the European states can get better deals collectively with other parts of the world. However, when you have large countries such as Germany imposing itself excessively on Hungary, Hungary has an incentive to diversify a bit, to reduce some of this pressure, so to connect more with China, other countries in the East, and this creates an incentive for the Germans realizing if they want the functionality of the EU to work, then to be optimal, then there's a limit on how much pressure they can put on member states or impose themselves. So it's in theory, this should at least have a disciplining
The problem
effect.
is, I agree with all these points. The problem is that the system is a bit less predictable and you have much more risk and uncertainty in the multipolar system compared with the hegemonic system. And this uncertainty and risks can lead actually to the conflicts which nobody wishes. So that would be, but I agree, it's like it has been the debate which has been led for centuries inside realism, about hegemonic realism, balance of power realism. And now we actually obviously see the end or the decay of American hegemony. So the question is whether we really end up in a multipolar order or whether there will be a new hegemon. And the question is whether it will be a conflict between China, India. It's difficult to say for us right now. I have one final question which goes beyond the book, because the opinions which we can read in your book, or I wouldn't say opinions, these are sort of scientifically facts-based conclusions. And what you said in this debate is actually considered sort of an opinion crime in Czechia. So in the sense that you deviate too much from the common doxa, from the truths which are officially agreed, which are officially promoted. In Czechia, the situation is actually quite harsh. People can be fired from their positions. They are investigated. Myself, I was fired from one institution, investigated by another institution. Ethical panels are actually engaged in this kind of stuff. How is the situation on Norway? Because you are quite outspoken. You do not hide your views. You argue. You are active on all kinds of social media. Do you encounter any kind of problems in Norway?
Oh yes, plenty, but it's quite predictable because, well, again, everything is simplified and dumbed down to being pro-Ukrainian, anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian. So if during the days of the Minsk agreement, if you say we have to implement the Minsk agreement, those people labeling themselves as pro-Ukrainians, they said no, we don't have to do this. It's a capitulation to Russia. So that was a good position. So you're either for not implementing it or you're with the Russians. So, and of course the same now goes for the war. That is, if you suggested let's have a compromise, let's sit down, find diplomatic solutions, then you're anti-Ukrainians because you don't believe in their freedom, the right to self-determination, and you're taking the side of Russia. So this means also that you have to be censored and cancelled. Of course, I think the problem is that the people have positioned themselves as pro-Ukrainians. They sabotaged every pathway to peace. They put these maximalist positions where only a victory which couldn't be achieved was presented. They made Ukraine effectively an existential threat to the Russians. Once Ukraine began to be decimated, all these horrific hundreds of thousands of dead, they didn't call for compromise. Instead, they continued a war which couldn't be won. And this is all done under the guise of helping, being good, protecting, standing for a liberal democracy. And so it's worth exploring where this actually comes from, because for me, this is the most gruesome thing we could possibly do to the Ukrainians. And yet this is what we've done under this auspices of being pro-Ukrainian. And I think it's worth going back to some of the EU's own history, because for those who study the EU, especially in the 90s, you had people like Schimmelfenning who presented this concept of rhetorical trap, because many European countries wasn't in favor of expanding the EU, taking new members, but they essentially set the premise that, well, the EU is about democracy and supporting it. So either you support liberal democracy or you defeat it, or you hate it, sabotage it. And under this, countries would do things which wasn't in their national interest. They would agree to enlargement, even though simply because they would be shamed. Everything was good versus evil. And this struggle of good versus evil is something that means you can't take an opposing view, and also you can't really prepare for the unfavorable outcomes, which might even be mitigated. And this is a way to effectively undermine reason, and we do this in all areas. If you look across the West now, if you criticize maybe a lot of immigration has demographic problems, well, you're racist. If you're for traditional marriage, you hate the gays. If you're against abortion, you're against women's right. If you don't
in all these disputes, I tend to be on the other side, so on the wrong side from the politically correct people. So we fight these fights in Czechia. But how is it in Norway? Is there certain tolerance, or what does it mean if you are on the wrong side? I mean, on the wrong side from the perspective of politically correct people. What does it mean in Norway for your life, for your profession? You still teach at university, as I see. Or was there any pressure for you actually to be like investigated or fired? How is it there?
Plenty, because the same good versus bad logic consists there as well. So if you criticize the war and NATO's role in it, then you're repeating Kremlin talking points and you're anti-Ukrainian, all of this nonsense. But for this reason, there's plenty of articles written every now and then about me that I'm carrying water for Putin, I'm legitimizing them. Again, this is when narrative comes over facts. This is, let's say the other day I made the point that because NATO escalates by sending long-range weapons, the Russians are doing a horizontal escalation where they give weapons to and technology to the North Koreans and the Iranians. So now you're justifying it. You're taking the side of the authoritarian. So if you give a fact, even though it's a fact, it still legitimizes a competing narrative. So this is why they come for you. And this is So there's been plenty of articles about me. You have these NGOs financed by the U.S. State Department and National Endowment for Democracy. Especially in Norway, the leading one is the Norwegian Helsinki Committee. They write, their average daily tweets almost. And
these are horrible institutions. We know them from here. They have such nice, noble names like National Endowment for Democracy or Helsinki Committee, and they are committing such strange things.
But this was deliberately how propaganda was set up, especially in the 80s. That is, if you sell to the public great power politics through the language of human rights organizations, then great power rivalry is a struggle between good and bad evils. You're not supporting NATO expansion. You're supporting democracy and freedom. So it's a good way of selling a war to a public. But for this reason, every time I'm invited to speak anywhere, they try to have the event cancelled, or at least my invitation cancelled.
So you experience the same. You experience the same as us here. So I mean, it's great that you persist. I think it's very important. For us, it's basically, even though it sounds a bit pathetic, it's fight for freedom to some extent, because we experienced this communism, and then with the transformations in the 1990s, we believe many of us said, well, the things are not as good as we imagined, but we still have the freedom, and that's like the basic difference. Now, after 30 years, I cannot say the same, actually, because we are getting less and less freedom than we had in the 1990s. So there was this freedom moment. Now it's actually getting worse here.
Yeah, that's what makes it very exhausting, I guess, to often be here. Like, I don't teach classes like I've written 11 books on Russian foreign policy and geoeconomics. I don't teach Russian. I'd rather not mention Russia in the classroom because, one of these NGOs could accuse you of indoctrinating students. It just becomes exhausting often because at the moment, everyone that challenges the status quo, so the rise of China, Russia, whatever it is, everything is considered a threat, and we always have narratives trumping reality. So if you try to, again, do your job and explain the changing world around you, you're accused of legitimizing it. So,
but what can give you some force or energy in your further persistence is that the books you write are important. I mean, the book which we discuss about is really an important book. It's not just an interesting book. It's an important book, and I'm really happy that it will be published in Czechia, and we will organize some public events around it, and I'm looking forward to it. There will be, of course, some disputes, there will be attacks, but we are ready for it. So, Glenn, thank you very much. Thank you very, very much for this talk. And I suggest that at some point in few months, we can repeat, we can make a talk again about talking about some political issues. And if you feel free, it will be fine.
Oh, sure. That would be great. Anytime. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.